What this poll was about was asking Iraqis, if they were given the vote, if they voted, what kind of political party would they be likely to vote for? Essentially what this poll was about was assessing the risk of democracy to this neoliberal project. The results were rather dismaying to the people conducting the poll. I'll give you a few examples. They asked them if they would vote for a party promising to create, quote, more government jobs. Would you vote for such a party? And 49% of Iraqis said yes, we would vote for a party promising to create more government jobs. Then they asked them, would you vote for a party promising to create more private sector jobs? 4.6% of them said they would vote for such a party. Because, of course, they had learned about capitalism from Halliburton and Bechtel. So it had something of a boomerang effect. They also asked them if they would vote for a party, quote, promising to keep coalition forces until security is good. 4.2 said yes. In other words, if Iraqis were given the vote at this time as they had been promised, because of course Paul Bremer was supposed to hand over power directly to an elected government, then they would have lost the goals of the war. They would not have had their military bases, and they would have lost access to Iraq for foreign multinationals, because Iraqis were clearly losing faith in the free market. So suddenly those elections that had been promised started to look like not such a great idea after all. And that is when we started to see a 2-year campaign to limit the freedoms of Iraqis, the freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom from torture and abuse, freedom to organize, trade unions, freedom to vote. It hasn't just been this happy, steady progression climaxing in the January 30th elections. The reality has been very different. You probably all followed that recent scandal with CNN's news director being forced to resign because he said at Davos he objected to the characterization of the killing of journalists in Iraq as collateral damage. He said it wasn't collateral damage, journalists are being targeted. This caused an uproar, and apparently the real story is about the power of blogs. I thought the story was about what he actually said, which is that journalists are being targeted in Iraq, which they are. Arab journalists in particular have been systematically targeted, particularly in the past year, with direct violence. Many people have been killed, but also with arrests, with bans, like on Al Jazeera, which is no longer allowed in Iraq, and with extreme political pressure. Last week, the Senate Democratic Policy Committee had hearings on waste and fraud and abuse in the US government's contracting in Iraq, which is a very broad topic, and they heard all kinds of evidence. A lot of it concentrated on the fact that they've misplaced $8.8 billion of Iraq's oil money. But they heard testimony from a lot of contractors who had worked in Iraq, and just harrowing testimony, including from a guy named Don North, who was working for the television station that the US created in Iraq, the state-funded television station, Iraqia, which originally was called the Iraqi Media Network. And he said, and I'll quote, he said, in Iraq there's a brutal form of journalism training being delivered by the US Army and the CPA officials when they found stories offensive. They visited the offices of offending newspapers and often left them padlocked and in ruins. No mediation and no appeal. So this has been going on without any reporting. Because once it became clear that Iraqis had these ideas of their own that were fundamentally in opposition to the ideas of their occupiers, freedom was actively suppressed across the board. Those local elections I told you about, the spontaneously organized local elections, Bremer ordered them all canceled, no more elections in cities and towns. And in fact, they gave a contract to an American company called the Research Triangle Institute. These guys are ideologues. They believe in privatizing everything, so they privatized democracy. They gave a contract to this company to bring democracy to Iraq's 18 provinces. I visited these guys. They're in North Carolina, sort of an industrial research park in North Carolina. It's very strange. You're sort of in the middle of nowhere, and they have their charts, and they have very strong ideas about what Iraq's democracy should look like. And they would go to towns with these charts and explain to them all the stages that people had to go through. They had to go to democracy school first, learn about civil society. Iraqis hate this phrase, civil society. They say, are we not civilized? Which I think is a question. And what RTI would do, what the Research Triangle Institute would do, is they would appoint the local council because Iraqis were not ready for democracy. They would often put generals in charge, often ex-Ba'athist generals who had long histories of human rights abuses because these were the people they could trust to keep the communities in line. And there was a great story in the Washington Post about when RTI comes to town with their flow charts, going to the local council meeting and announcing that they were appointing the local government, and then being told, but we had elections, we already have a government. They quoted somebody saying, we feel like we're going backwards, not forwards, and in fact, they were going backwards. Bremer's next move was to cancel the national elections altogether. He announced this on November 15th, 2003, after meeting with George Bush. He said that there'd been a change of plans, that Iraq wasn't ready for national elections, they couldn't hand over power to an elected government. Instead, they were going to appoint the interim government. It was a complicated process where there would be, they would appoint a caucus, and then they would appoint people to the National Assembly. And it was sort of an appointocracy rather than a democracy, especially because Paul Bremer was himself appointed to this post, never elected to anything in the United States, let alone Iraq. And then if you think back and realize that Paul Bremer was appointed to his post by George W. Bush, who was appointed to his post by the Supreme Court, you have appointees, appointees, appointees running Iraq. Now, the idea was that Bremer would also write a constitution before they would hand over power because he was worried once again, about trusting Iraqis with their own democracy. And he managed to work a clause into this constitution that made it absolutely illegal to amend or rescind any of those 100 orders that he had written, which is handy. Well, it didn't work. And Iraqis took a look at this, and they said, maybe you need to go to democracy school. They had this crazy idea, which is that they should elect their first sovereign government. And more than that, they had this other crazy idea, which is that the constitution of the country should be written by the people who they elected, as opposed to people who were appointed or their foreign occupiers. So they had a massive protest a year ago, January 19th, 2004. There were 100,000 people on the streets of Baghdad, and their chant was, yes, yes, elections, no, no, selection. They were willing to do stuff to be free. In fact, this was the largest nonviolent demonstration, political demonstration, that Iraq had seen in decades. And they were dismissed. The Bush administration said, no, Iraq is too dangerous. And that really amazes me, because even to think of 100,000 people on the streets of Baghdad today having a peaceful demonstration, it's unimaginable. The country is so much more treacherous, became that much more treacherous in the intervening year. That betrayal, that decision not to listen to those 100,000 people shouting for elections, another 30,000 on the streets of Basra, was a kind of a fork in the roads. That was the time that things got very bad. And the situation took a turn for the much more violent. In fact, that month, the month that they decided, they made it clear that they weren't going to listen to the protesters and that they were going to push ahead with their interim government anyway, was the bloodiest month. 82 US soldiers were killed that month. And after that,